In 1969, while the eyes of the world were fixed on the lunar surface, a far more desperate and grounding mission was unfolding in the freezing, grey hell of the North Sea. Britain was a sovereign power, held hostage by its own lack of fuel. An empire running on empty while facing a geopolitical winter that threatened to stall its economy forever. Every expert from the established geologists to the cautious bureaucrats in Whitehall said the North Sea was a dead zone, a graveyard for ships, perhaps, but empty of liquid gold. They were wrong. What followed was not a simple stroke of luck, but a brutal, high-stakes engineering war against nature to drag a fortune out of an abyss that no one believed could be tamed. This is the story of how the impossible was built when the stakes were nothing less than national survival. To really understand the magnitude of what changed in 1969, you have to look at the sheer vulnerability of the British Isles during that era. For decades, the United Kingdom had built its industrial might on the back of coal, but by the mid-20th century, the global paradigm had shifted toward petroleum. The problem was stark until the late 1960s. The British economy was almost entirely dependent on imported energy. Every drop of oil that lubricated the gears of British industry or fueled the cars on the newly built motorways came from thousands of miles away. Primarily from the Middle East and Nigeria, this was not just a matter of trade. It was a matter of national security. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had already left a deep, painful scar on the British psyche, proving that the nation's lifeblood could be cut off by a foreign power at any moment. Britain was essentially the sick man of Europe, struggling with a massive balance of payments deficit, where every fluctuation in the price of a barrel of crude in Riyadh could trigger a sterling crisis in London. Therefore, the search for domestic oil was not merely a commercial venture, but a frantic necessity for survival. A quest to regain a sovereignty that had been slipping away since the end of the Second World War. But the geologists of the era were largely skeptical, trapped in a mindset that dictated where oil should be based on decades of terrestrial exploration. The first significant explorations only occurred in the late 1960s, because the consensus was that the North Sea was a barren wasteland for liquid hydrocarbons. Early explorations were met with consistent disappointment, and many experts believed the North Sea basin was too young or incorrectly structured to house significant liquid reserves. Geophysics in the 1960s was a primitive art compared to today's 3D seismic imaging. Ships trailed sparker and boomer sound sources, sending low-frequency acoustic waves into the seabed to map the layers of rock below. These analog signals were recorded on paper scrolls, and geophysicists had to manually interpret the ghosts of the Permian and Jurassic layers. While natural gas had been found in the West Sole field in 1965, the consensus remained that oil was a fantasy. The prevailing theory suggested that while gas might be trapped in the Permian sandstones, the organic-rich source, rocks required for oil the kitchens where heat and pressure cook ancient life into fuel simply did not exist in the British sector. This skepticism created a massive loop of doubt in the halls of government and the boardrooms of oil majors. Therefore, the British government took a gamble on policy, passing the Continental Shelf Act of 1964. This legislation was a masterstroke of administrative foresight, dividing the sea into blocks and providing a legal framework that would allow private companies the security they needed to invest billions in what was essentially a blind search. It established the median line principle, ensuring that the UK had a clear, legal claim to its sector, even if no one was yet sure what that sector actually contained. The legal certainty provided by this act was the therefore that allowed the oil majors to justify the astronomical costs of exploration in such a hostile environment. Without this legal framework, the financial risk would have been prohibitive, as a single exploration well in 1969 could cost over £1 million, a staggering sum at the time. The first crack in the wall of impossibility appeared not in British waters, but in the Norwegian sector, and it was the result of pure, stubborn persistence and a stroke of contractual fate. In 1969, Phillips Petroleum was on the verge of financial ruin after drilling several dry holes in the North Sea. Their board of directors was ready to abandon the mission and take the loss. But because of a specific contractual obligation that made it cheaper to drill one more well than to pay the cancellation fees for their rig lease, they were forced to drill one final hole, the 2/4-to-1. This last-ditch effort struck the Ekofisk field in 1969. A discovery so massive it proved that the North Sea's geological system was not only active but incredibly rich. The oil was found in a thick layer of chalk, a reservoir rock that geologists had previously ignored, believing it lacked the permeability to let oil flow. This discovery in the Norwegian sector immediately inspired a renewed, almost feverish exploration in the British sector. The doubt that had paralyzed the industry for years was replaced by a gold rush mentality, though the gold was buried under hundreds of feet of water and miles of ancient rock. Shortly after the Norwegian breakthrough in 1970, British Petroleum BP deployed its own crown jewel, the Sea Quest drilling rig. They targeted a block approximately 110 miles northeast of Aberdeen. In October of 1970, BP discovered the massive Forties field, confirming that the UK was sitting on a subsea fortune. The Forties field was one of the largest offshore oil fields in the world, and its discovery confirmed that the UK's economic trajectory was about to be reshaped for decades to come. But the celebration was short-lived, as the sheer mechanical reality of the situation set in. The North Sea is perhaps the most hostile environment on Earth for offshore engineering. The water depth in the Forties field was over 350 feet, and the weather conditions were legendary for their violence. Waves could reach 100 feet, and height and winds often exceeded 100 miles per hour. The 100-year storm was a constant threat, and the engineering required to extract this oil had to be invented from scratch. Therefore, the industry could not simply use the technology developed for the calm, shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico. They needed structures that were essentially underwater skyscrapers made of steel, capable of withstanding the relentless fatigue caused by the North Sea's currents. The fabrication of these structures, known as jackets, represented the greatest metallurgical challenge of the decade. These were the steel legs of the platforms, designed to sit on the seabed and support tens of thousands of tons of machinery above the waves. Bildem the industry had massive fabrication yards at Nig Bay and Graythorpe. Nig Bay, in particular, became the site of one of the largest dry docks in the world. A colossal concrete basin where thousands of workers labored in shifts to weld the massive steel pipes. Each jacket was a lattice of high-tensile steel pipes, some as thick as a man is tall. The engineers faced a terrifying problem: brittle fracture. In the sub-zero temperatures of the North Sea floor, standard steel could become as fragile as glass. A single hairline crack, if left unchecked, could cause a catastrophic collapse under the weight of the platform. Therefore, the British steel industry had to develop entirely new alloys such as the BS for 360. Grade 50 dash strong in extreme cold. Once built, these jackets were too heavy for any crane to lift, but they had to be moved to the middle of the sea. Therefore, engineers built them on their sides, attached them to massive flotation tanks, and towed them out into the Atlantic with a fleet of tugboats. The installation process, known as appending, was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Once the jacket reached the Forties field, engineers began a carefully choreographed flooding of the flotation tanks. As the air escaped and the water rushed in, the massive steel structure would slowly tilt from horizontal to vertical. It was a heart-stopping procedure. If the flooding was uneven, the structure could flip or sink to the bottom, lost forever along with hundreds of millions of pounds of investment. But the jackets held, settling into the seabed where they were then pinned down by steel piles driven 80 feet into the earth. This required a hammer with a force of several thousand foot-pounds to strike the piles repeatedly until they achieved refusal in the dense glacial clays of the seabed. Once the skeleton was in place, the topside modules, the living quarters, the drilling floor, and the processing plants were lifted into place by the world's largest crane barges. These platforms were cities in the sea, powered by gas turbines and manned by crews of hundreds who worked 12-hour shifts in some of the most isolated conditions on the planet. But the real work, the most dangerous work, was happening below the surface. To connect the platforms to the coast, BP had to lay a 32-inch diameter pipeline across 110 miles of uneven seabed. This required a new breed of worker, the saturation diver, to work on pipelines and platform legs at depths of several hundred feet. Divers had to live for weeks at a time in pressurized chambers, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen heliox to prevent the nitrogen narcosis that would otherwise be fatal. This was the squeeze. The divers lived in a habitat no larger than a small van, transferring to a diving bell that lowered them into the dark, freezing water. They were disconnected from the atmospheric world. Even their voices changed to a high-pitched squeak due to the density of the helium. The physics of this were brutal. Helium conducts heat away from the body 6 times faster than air, meaning divers were constantly fighting hypothermia, even in heated suits. Furthermore, the pressure at these depths meant that any rapid ascent would cause the gases in their blood to boil, leading to an agonizing death. These divers were the infantry of the oil revolution, working in near-total darkness to ensure that the infrastructure of the future remained intact. Their bravery and the technical advancements in hyperbaric welding, the ability to weld pipe in a dry, pressurized chamber at the bottom of the ocean, allowed the North Sea fields to become the most technologically advanced energy hub in the world. This era of wildcat diving was essentially unregulated, leading to a high fatality rate as the limits of human biology were tested against the laws of physics. However, the data gathered during these missions eventually allowed the Royal Navy and industry experts to develop decompression tables that are still the global standard today. The timeline of this transformation is often misunderstood. While 1969 marks the beginning of the discoveries, the idea that Britain became wealthy overnight is a myth. Large-scale production did not start immediately, as the first commercial fields only came online in the early 1970s. The logistical challenge of building hundreds of miles of subsea pipelines and massive production platforms meant that commercial production only truly began to transform the British economy during the mid to late 1970s. The Argyle field began commercial production in June 1975, followed by the Forties system later that year. This gap meant that Britain had to endure the 1973 oil crisis without the protection of its own reserves. Therefore, when the 1973 embargo by the OAPEC, nations quadrupled the price of oil almost overnight. It sent the British economy into a tailspin. This period was characterized by the infamous 3-day week, where the government restricted electricity use to conserve fuel. This was a time of candle-lit dinners and by choice, but it had as the nations of collapse. But this conflict served as a massive catalyst. What was once a marginal and expensive engineering project became a national priority of the highest order. The high price of oil suddenly made the astronomical costs of North Sea development economically viable. The fortune the title mentions was being dragged out of the sea, but it was being paid for with the sweat of workers and the immense capital of a nation on the brink. As the steel rose from the waves, the impact on land was equally profound, specifically in the city of Aberdeen. Before the 1970s, Aberdeen was a quiet granite city built on the back of a dwindling fishing industry and textile mills. But the discovery of the Forties field changed everything. Aberdeen became the front line of the North Sea boom, transforming almost overnight into the oil capital of Europe. The harbor, which once hosted small trawlers, was dredged and expanded to accommodate massive supply vessels and heavy-lift barges. Therefore, the local economy shifted from the sea's surface to its depths. The gray granite streets began to hum with the sound of American accents as Texas oil men brought their expertise to the cold Northeast. This was Texas on the Don, a cultural and economic collision where local pubs suddenly started serving T-bone steaks and bourbon. Property prices skyrocketed, and Aberdeen's Dice Airport soon became the busiest heliport in the world. Ferrymen of the sky carrying thousands of workers to and from the offshore cities every single day. The logistics were staggering. Millions of tons of food, drill pipe, and chemicals had to be moved from the quayside to the platforms 100 miles out, requiring a fleet of specialized supply ships designed to hold position in the middle of a gale. However, the political landscape was also shifting. The Scottish question emerged as a dominant force, with the Scottish National Party SNP launching its iconic It's Scotland's Oil campaign. They argued that the wealth being extracted from the waters off the Scottish coast was being used to subsidize the failing industries of the south of England. This tension created a lasting rift in the British political fabric, leading 2 decades of debate over devolution and independence. The fortune was not just an economic windfall. It was a political hand grenade. But for the engineers and workers on the rigs, the politics were a world away. Their daily reality was a battle against lamellar tearing, a technical flaw in steel plates that could cause the welded joints of the platforms to split under high stress. Metallurgists eventually solved this by developing Z-quality steel, which had improved ductility in the through-thickness direction, a breakthrough that became essential for all subsequent deep-water structures worldwide. Furthermore, the expansion of the workforce required a massive training effort. The industry established the Offshore Petroleum Industry Training Board OPITB, creating rigorous standards for sea survival, firefighting, and first aid. This turned a disorganized group of merchant seamen and construction workers into a highly specialized professional cadre. But with great wealth and rapid growth came great risk, and the industry's most harrowing chapter was yet to be written. The 1980s were a time of breakneck production, often at the expense of rigorous safety protocols. On July 6, 1988, the Piper Alpha platform, located 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen, became the site of the world's deadliest offshore oil disaster. The catastrophe began not with a massive storm, but with a simple maintenance failure, a breakdown in communication. A pressure safety valve had been removed from a backup propane condensate pump for routine maintenance. But the paperwork was miscommunicated. When the primary pump failed, a technician, unaware that the safety valve was missing, restarted the backup pump. This triggered a massive gas leak and an immediate explosion. However, the initial blast was only the beginning. Piper Alpha was a central hub for other platforms Starton and Claymore, which continued to pump high-pressure gas into the burning structure, effectively turning the platform into a massive blowtorch. The firewalls, designed to stop oil fires, were only A60 rated, meaning they were not built to withstand the intense heat of gas explosions. Furthermore, the emergency shutdown valves were located on the platform itself, meaning they were destroyed in the first blast and could not be reached. Therefore, the disaster escalated with terrifying speed. 167 men lost their lives that night, many trapped in the accommodation block as the platform melted and collapsed into the sea. This event forced a fundamental rethink of platform design. Post-Piper Alpha, platforms were built with blast walls designed to withstand massive overpressures, and living quarters were moved as far as possible from the high-pressure gas modules. The aftermath of Piper Alpha led to the Cullen Report, a landmark investigation that forever changed the industry. Lord Cullen issued 106 recommendations that completely overhauled offshore safety standards. The most significant change was the transfer of safety responsibility from the Department of Energy, whose primary goal was production, to the Health and Safety Executive, eliminating the conflict of interest. Therefore, the industry shifted from a compliance-based safety culture to a goal-setting one, where operators had to prove their safety cases for every platform. This was the moment the North Sea matured, realizing that the fortune could not be dragged out at the cost of human life. The 1990s and 2000s saw a massive investment in safety technology, including fire-resistant living quarters and emergency shutdown valves located on the seabed rather than on the platforms themselves. These subsea valves meant that even if a platform was destroyed, the flow of gas from the surrounding fields could be cut off at the source. By 1999, the North Sea reached its record peak output, hitting a massive 4.5 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent per day. It was the Golden Hav of the Norths, a chimihuende benchmark, a blend of oils from several North Sea fields became the global reference price for crude oil. The Brent field itself, discovered in 1971, was a marvel of geology consisting of 5 distinct reservoir sands. But even at the height of this prosperity, the first signs of the post-peak era were beginning to show. The reservoirs were maturing and the physics of extraction were changing. As the pressure in the fields dropped, water began to seep into the wells, requiring massive water injection systems to keep the oil flowing. Therefore, the costs of extraction were rising as companies were forced to target smaller, more difficult pockets of oil. The 1990s also brought a new kind of challenge: environmental scrutiny. The public, who had once viewed the rigs as symbols of national pride, began to see them as industrial intruders. In 1995, the Brent Spar incident became a watershed moment. The Brent Spar was a massive oil storage buoy that Shell UK planned to scuttle in the deep Atlantic. Despite having the support of the UK government, Shell faced international outrage led by Greenpeace activists. This conflict turned the Brent field into a battlefield between environmentalism and industry. Ultimately, Shell gave in to public pressure and dismantled the Brent Spar on land. This event led to the OSPAR 98/3 decision, which effectively banned the disposal of disused offshore installations at sea. The fortune dragged out of the sea now carried a permanent responsibility: the requirement to bring every ton of steel back to shore at the end of its life. This created a new industry decommissioning which is arguably as complex as the original construction. As we entered the 2000s, the North Sea began its natural decline. Production fell significantly, and the aging infrastructure of the 1970s and 80s was becoming a liability. Decommissioning the process of safely removing and recycling offshore platforms became the next great engineering challenge. This is not a simple task of taking things apart. For fields like the Brent field, it involves removing massive topsides, some weighing over 24,000 tons, using the world's largest crane vessels, such as the pioneering Spirit. This single-lift technology is a marvel of modern naval architecture, allowing a ship to slide its twin hulls around a platform and lift the entire structure in a few seconds. Furthermore, the subsea wells must be plugged and abandoned, a process of injecting cement deep into the earth to ensure that no oil or gas ever leaks into the ocean. The investigator of archive now studies the original blueprints from the 1970s, not to see how to build, but how to safely dismantle these industrial leviathans without polluting the very sea that provided the nation's wealth. The economic impact of this transition has been dubbed Dutch disease in some circles, where the influx of oil wealth caused the manufacturing sector to shrink as the pound grew stronger. However, for the majority of the population, the oil wealth provided a vital cushion during the transition to a service-based economy. Today, the North Sea is undergoing its most radical transformation yet. While oil and gas production continues to fall, the basin is becoming a powerhouse for renewable energy. The same subsea characteristics and harsh winds that once made oil extraction a nightmare now make the North Sea one of the best places for offshore wind on the planet. The skills of the oil industry, subsea engineering, marine logistics, and complex project management are being repurposed for offshore wind, hydrogen production, and carbon capture and storage (CCS). CCS, in particular, is a poetic ending to the oil story. The idea is to pump carbon dioxide back into the empty oil and gas reservoirs. Using the same fortune to heal the atmosphere, the North Sea is no longer just an oil basin. It is Europe's energy powerhouse for the 21st century. The massive Dogger Bank wind farm, currently under construction, will be the largest in the world, sitting atop the very sands where geologists once hunted for Permian gas. Looking back at 1969, the story of the North Sea is one of extreme risks and extreme rewards. The subsea fortune essentially bankrolled the modernization of the British economy. It provided a shield against global volatility and allowed for a level of sovereign independence that seemed impossible when the first geologists shook their heads in doubt. The fortune was not just dragged out. It was earned through a level of engineering bravery and metallurgical innovation that remains unparalleled in the history of the industrial world. They proved that when a nation is pushed to the edge, the only way forward is down into the depths and back up with the future in hand. The year 1969 may belong to the moon in the history books, but for the United Kingdom, the real giant leap was taken 350 feet below the waves. As the oil fades and the wind turbines rise, the legacy remains. The North Sea did not just save Britain. It defined its modern identity. It was a commercial boom that reshaped the economic trajectory for decades to come, proving that even in the freezing dark, there is a fortune for those brave enough to reach for it. To wrap up this forensic look at the basin, we have to acknowledge the staggering scale of the pipelines. Laying the 40s pipeline wasn't just about dropping pipe into the water. Every section had to be coated in high-density concrete to provide negative buoyancy, ensuring it stayed on the seabed even when empty. This coating had to be precisely applied to prevent cracking during the S-curve bend as the pipe descended from the lay barge to the seafloor. It's these unsung details, the concrete chemistry, the specialized alloys, the relentless maintenance of subsea valves that kept the fortune flowing. The story of 1969 is often told through the lens of politics or economics, but it is fundamentally a story of engineering excellence. It was the moment the British people realized that their island home was sitting on a reservoir of potential that could only be accessed through sheer grit and intellectual firepower. From the first seismic trace on a paper scroll to the final decommissioning lift, the North Sea has been a testament to what we can achieve when we refuse to accept that a resource is unreachable. The fortune was there all along, hidden under millions of tons of freezing water, just waiting for a generation of engineers to find a way to drag it into the light. And as we move into the era of wind and carbon capture, that same spirit of innovation is what will power the next 50 years of energy independence. The abyss was tamed, and in doing so, the nation was transformed.